Right, so it looks like people have started to come into the session. Welcome everyone to this plenary session of day 4 on this festival that we're arranging. Happy you've all tuned in. My name is Benedict Goodman. I'm part of Rethinking Economics in Norway. Recently finished my Bachelor in Economics, and yeah, I'm sat in the lovely city of Oslo. I'll be chairing this session today, and today we've got Stephen Marglin with us, Professor Emeritus of Harvard University, and among other things, he's the author of a book called The Dismal Science: How Thinking Like an Economist Undermines Community. It's a book that examines the underlying presuppositions of economics, individualism, self-interest, a world without limits, knowledge as logical deduction from self-evident first principles, and community limited to the nation state. It's a book about big concepts. This webinar has got the title of Raising Keynes, which is the title of Stephen's new book, which will be published at some point during this autumn. The date is not set yet due to COVID-19, but we'll keep you posted on that. So without saying too much about this book, it's a recasting of the arguments made by Keynes in the general theory in a more dynamic form, and as well as re-evaluation of the building blocks in Keynes' masterpiece. So this will be a webinar where Stephen will hold his talk for about 20 minutes, and after that we will be opening up for a Q&A. So throughout the seminar, you can use the Q&A function, and we've got voting, so you can vote on the different questions. And then once we get to the Q&A, you can, well, we will pick the questions with the most votes and read them out to Stephen so we can answer them. Cecilia, who is part of Rethinking Economics Denmark, is running the tech of this session. And she's part of also writing a curriculum review in Denmark. So keep your eyes peeled for that. Anything you wish to say, Cecilia?
I'm going to say hello, everyone. Welcome.
All right. So we don't have too many rules. We just please write down your questions, as I said, and have a good time. So without saying much more, I'll give the word to you, Stephen. Welcome. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you, Benedict. It's absolutely my pleasure. I have to say this is the first large conference that I've participated in Zoom. I've been, of course, by now in many meetings, but this is a new experience and a learning one for me. So I guess we're all learning together. I'm not sure I heard you correctly, but I think I heard you say that I'm a professor emeritus. No,
I did, yeah. You have to correct me on that.
Not a professor emeritus. I'm just a professor. People
Oh.
ask me, "Oh, are you retired yet?" And I say, "No, I'm tired, but I'm not retired."
Wow, I just sort of assumed that. Wow, yeah. Well done you.
Well, I have to say, teaching, you know, they say it's a cliche, teaching keeps you young, but I have to say, writing this book, which I'm about to tell you something about, the interaction with students has been very important because the questions that come up, the looks of blank stares at some point when I talk, and makes it clear that I'm just not getting through, and maybe that I don't understand what I'm trying to present. I don't think I could have written this book without at the same time teaching a course in it. This has been my experience for some time, I have to say. And when I started teaching this course called Keynes with the course catalog number EC 1936, and that 1936 should ring a bell because it's the date of the publication of the general theory. I thought I was interrupting an alternative introduction to economics that I'd done for many years, and which had a big influence on the other book that you mentioned, The Dismal Science. And I thought, well, I'm going to put that aside for a couple of years while I write this Keynes book. But those couple of years have turned into about 10, and I think I can wind this course down next year, because I think once the book is actually out, the necessity for teaching the course will be much less. Anyway, let me just say a couple of words about how I came to write this book, and then tell you a little bit about what's in it, and then save most of the time for questions. So, background. I've been interested in Keynes, and particularly in the general theory, since I started studying economics more than half a century ago. And had done other things, come back to Keynes over the years, and had even taught a course for 3 or 4 years around the turn of this century, but gave it up. And I basically gave it up for lack of interest. The students just were not interested in Keynes at that point, and just as the profession was not interested in Keynes. It was really the nadir of Keynes's trajectory. But all this changed on a particular day in September of 2008, September 15th to be exact, which was the Monday after Lehman Brothers crashed. And how I came to write the book was a chance meeting. I was back in the economics department. I just come back from teaching, giving a lecture in this alternative introductory economic course that I mentioned. And a whole group of younger professors, some graduate students, mostly younger professors. And I have to say, this is not to my credit, but some of them were so young that I didn't even know who they were. But anyway, they were having a very heated conversation about whether these financial events were going to have an impact on the real economy, because as you all know, the economic theory makes a distinction between the nominal economy and the real economy. And the real economy exists over here, and the nominal economy exists over here. And the so-called classical dichotomy, the twain do not really have to meet. So here in the wake of Lehman Brothers crash, were these earnest young men, not many women, if I remember correctly, discussing whether that was true, whether this cataclysmic financial events were going to have any impact on the real economy. And I kind of listened and took the temper of the debate. And I have to say that the opinions were divided, but the overwhelming sense that I got from that group was weren't going to have much of an effect. And I said to myself, Keynes's moment is coming back. And at this point, there will be a lot of interest in Keynes, and I don't have to do this sort of on my own time. I can do it now as this book that I had in some sense in mind. I could do it as a professional project. So that's where the idea came from. As I said, my thought was that this was something I would do in a couple of years, or no, I guess we were talking earlier and I mentioned this, that this was something that I could do in a couple of years and then get back to teaching this introductory alternative to the mainstream introduction. And it took me about 2 years to figure out how little I really knew. I mean, I thought when I went into it, I thought, yeah, I know what I want to say. I've got a kind of a sketch in my head. And it took about, yeah, I'd say 2 years to figure out how little I really knew. And the rest of the next several years learning what I had to learn, and then some years to write it down in a coherent form. So that's the genesis of the book. The book was scheduled to come out, I thought appropriately enough, on Bastille Day. But because of the COVID, everything got delayed, and I don't have a firm schedule, but I'm told it's sometime in the fall, or could even conceivably be in the late fall or early winter. So what is the book about? Well, there's some history of thought, there's some empirical analysis, but mainly this is a work on macroeconomic theory. It's my attempt to translate the vision that Keynes had in the general theory, and I say vision. I'm really have in mind here the distinction that Joseph Schumpeter made between vision and theory and model. But the vision is the kind of intuition, grand scheme, and the theory is the working out of this in some kind of coherent form. And Keynes had the vision, but I would argue that he never really got to the theory, and the task I set myself in Raising Keynes is to translate that vision into a theory and indeed models that can illuminate macroeconomics, not, as I say, in the context of the history of thought, though I hope it does that, but macroeconomics for today. So this is an alternative to the mainstream, and it's an alternative in two senses. It's an alternative in the very broad sense of challenging the orthodox view that a market economy is self-regulating, the invisible hand and all that. A perfectly competitive economy, according to the mainstream canon, an economy without the warts of market imperfections, rigidities, frictions, etc., will deliver, at the very least, an efficient allocation of resources. And that includes, as a part of that efficient allocation of resources, a job for every willing worker, full employment, to be in short. So, in a very fundamental sense, the point of my book, as was the point of the general theory, is to challenge that very rosy picture of how a market economy, how a capitalist economy works. It's an alternative, my book is an alternative macroeconomics in a much narrower sense, in that I lay out a specific macro theory that fleshes out the theory that's there in embryonic form in the general theory. So one of the assumptions I make pretty much throughout this book is that the world is a world of perfect competition. That's indeed the assumption that Keynes made, and I make it for the same reason that Keynes made it, namely, as he put it, if you want to disrupt orthodoxy, you have to attack them in their citadel. Attack them in their citadel is actually a phrase not from the general theory, but from a radio broadcast that Keynes made on the BBC the year before publication, and which was published in The Listener and then subsequently in the United States in the New Republic. And he says, look, everybody knows that there are warts on the body of capitalism, and that things don't function as smoothly and efficiently when there are these warts. For example, favorite warts on the right are trade unions, which screw up the wage setting process. Favorite warts on the left are monopoly capital, which screws up the pricing process. But according to the mainstream, if you can just get rid of the warts, then everything will be well. This isn't just theory. This is practice. In the run-up to the Great Recession, the financial crash that led to the Great Recession, this theory was put in practice in the form of continual deregulation, continual attempts to make the market work better. The mainstream is well aware of market imperfections, but the cure for the mainstream of a market imperfection is what? It's a better market. You might remember, though some of you who were around at the time, that Alan Greenspan, the then chair of the Federal Reserve, later said he was shocked when the financial system did not self-regulate after market forces were turned loose. So in order to forestall the argument, and this is the argument I'm really taking on, that the problem with capitalism are the frictions, the rigidities, etc. I set the argument in a world of perfect competition, and I argue that even in that world, and this was, I think, Keynes's fundamental point, this was his vision, a capitalist system is not self-regulating, and in particular, it does not produce, in general, full employment, and the intervention of government is necessary to do that. So, why is the book necessary? After all, Keynes was a master. He transformed the economics profession with the general theory. Why do we need another attempt? Well, Keynes had three interlocking goals in mind. This is my judgment. This is my gloss. He was a very practical person. He had a primary aim of revolutionizing economic policy. He had an equally important aim of revolutionizing economic theory, because he did not believe you could revolutionize policy without revolutionizing theory. And to accomplish both, he thought that it was necessary, and proclaims this in the preface to the book, to make a revolution in method, to shift from the comparative statics that is the stuff of economics then and is the stuff of economics now, to a dynamic analysis of the economy. Alas, he couldn't do it. He did not have the tools. Nobody had the tools. The tools didn't really exist to do this in a formal theoretical way. So it's not surprising he failed on the methodological account, but because of that failure, he failed to provide a convincing theory. And because the theory was not convincing, his policy agenda was adopted, but only kind of halfway. The surprising thing to me is looking at, and this is a history of thought part of it, and I don't know the answer to the question, is why the next generation of Keynesian economists who did have the tools, they did have the methodological tools available to them to do dynamic economics. It's been part of the profession for 60, 70 years. Why that wasn't turned to the questions that I take up in Raising Keynes of formulating the ideas of the general theory in dynamic terms. Not quite true that it didn't happen at all, but it happened half-heartedly, and I would judge unsuccessfully, and I trust I will be more successful. And so that remains a mystery. So what is the takeaway of the general theory? The main takeaway is that aggregate demand matters. Now that survives into mainstream economics, but it survives only in an attenuated form. Aggregate demand matters because there are frictions, imperfections, and rigidities. Remove those imperfections, remove those rigidities, aggregate demand doesn't matter anymore. And that is, of course, an important difference between the short run and the long run in the mainstream view. And all Keynesian economics today, so-called new Keynesian economics in the mainstream, is focused on the short run. And it's focused on the short run when, yes, there are these warts, there are rigidities, there are imperfections, and therefore aggregate demand matters. But first of all, the way to really deal with that is to remove the warts, make the economy more like the textbook. And we saw how well that worked in 2008. It worked dismally, dismal science. In the long run, the writ of Keynes, according to the mainstream, doesn't run at all. That's the realm for Keynesians and new classical economists. For the whole mainstream, that's the realm of good old-fashioned mainstream neoclassical economics, updated to be much more mathematically rigorous, but basically the same ideas that go back to Walras were canonized by Arrow and Degrowth. That is the general equilibrium model of a frictionless economy where the classical dichotomy holds, where everything is on the real side. Finances don't matter. So the first thing that I try to do in the general, the most important thing I think that I do in the general theory is to provide this dynamic basis for a theory that I think, to me, argues convincingly that unemployment, in general terms, the capitalist economy is not self-regulating, that unemployment is one possible outcome, but to do this, you have to jettison the comparative statics framework and focus on how economies adjust when they're not in equilibrium. And maybe they get to equilibrium, maybe they don't, but the focus is on the adjustment process. So that's a big part of the heavy lifting of the general theory. First, to show why you have to do that, and secondly, to do it. A second innovation is more technical, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this here. It's in the book, and I encourage you to read it, and I'd be glad to respond to questions in the question period. Let me just say briefly that the most original contribution of Keynes, apart from the putting together of the whole framework, which was, I would say, the major success of the general theory, was his theory of interest, so-called liquidity preference theory. The key insight here, and this is an insight which has been lost, it's not there anymore in mainstream economics, at least when you come to the long run. And in the short run, people seem to be very confused. But Keynes's main insight was that the locus of action for determination of interest rates is not saving and investment. It's not the forces of productivity and thrift, which if you pick up any mainstream standard introductory textbook, Mankiw, Baumol, Blinder, etc., you will find that argument, you'll find that diagram with a saving schedule and an investment schedule and an equilibrium that shows how interest rates are determined. It goes back to Knut Wicksell, but it's been part of the mainstream ever since. Keynes said, no, that's a category mistake. It's just not where the action is. The action is in assets for financial markets for financial assets. The dimensions are totally different. These are markets of stocks of assets, whereas investment and savings are flows. And the other point is, you can see immediately that this is going to connect the financial side of the economy to the real side. So that's a major insight. And it's a curious thing about economics is that unlike, I think, most sciences, economics is, I would say, a pretend science, but that's okay. Unlike natural sciences, there is obvious regression in economics because the mainstream has lost this key insight of Keynes as to where and how interest rates are determined. So that's the good news. That's the good part of Keynes's innovation. The part that needs correcting and needs to be, and that I believe that I have developed in an appropriate way, is how interest rates and what are actually determined in financial asset markets. Keynes thought it was the level of interest rates, and that was important. That's important because the level of interest rate rates that determines investment demand, and investment demand is an important component of aggregate demand, etc. That's what he thought he had. He didn't have that. What he actually had was a theory of what the spread is between various interest rates, like the spread between treasury bills, short-term 3-month treasury bills, and 10-year corporate bonds. What is the difference in the interest rates? Well, why does that matter? In one sense, it doesn't matter that much because we have central banks, and the central bank has for a long time had the role precisely of fixing the short-term interest rates and leaving it to financial markets to determine the spread and therefore the level of interest rates that influence the real economy. It matters a lot, however, for Keynes's fundamental project, which was to show that a capitalist economy left to its own devices without interventions from government institutions would not be self-regulating. So what he thought was that, yes, the interest rate that would be determined in financial markets would not be compatible necessarily with full employment, but it would produce an equilibrium. My argument is in a sense even more destructive of orthodoxy because it says that the model is actually incomplete and there is no theory of the level of interest rates in the absence of some government institution which supplements the invisible hand in providing regulation to the market, typically a central bank. So in terms of the theoretical objective of the general theory, I think Keynes fell short, and he was on the right track, but his models were too simple to reach the right conclusion, which is not only could equilibrium fall short of full employment or be in excess of full employment, but that the model by itself was actually incomplete and needs some addition in order to provide the level of interest rates and therefore a determinate level of output. This is more technical than I really want to get into, and I want to wind this part of the
That's all right. Let's see, there's always, by the way, to all the listeners, please keep your questions coming. The more questions, the more interesting we can make this at the end.
Yeah, I'm going to wind this up pretty quickly.
Sure, take your time.
So I mentioned a third thing that I think it's important in the year 2020, and that is to make it clear that Keynes's arguments apply to the long run as well as the short run. As I said, within the mainstream, insofar as there are Keynesians, and if you have taken undergraduate courses, intermediate courses, you will have encountered the new Keynesian model, and you will encounter people who are Keynesians, but they draw the line. They are Keynesians for the short run, and for the long run, they are mainstream neoclassical economists. Aggregate demand doesn't matter in the long run. And my argument is that aggregate demand does matter in the long run. And I provide a theoretical argument and some empirical um, investigation to support that argument, to show that essentially the same model, but with some important adaptations that works for the short run, also works for the long run, and in particular, aggregate demand matters. There are important consequences from that, and they are, in a sense, class consequences, but the classes are not so much labor and capital as they are Main Street and Wall Street. As far as Main Street is concerned, the trade-off between inflation and greater output and greater employment has two sides to it. And there's a political question and there's a question of political balance. There is no trade-off, of course, in the mainstream view, because there's no role for aggregate demand and there's no role for expanding output and employment by deploying aggregate demand. In the view that I'm putting forward, there is indeed a role for aggregate demand. There is indeed a role for, there is indeed a conflict between more employment and more output on the one hand and more inflation on the other, and that's a political question. And as I said, I think it divides Main Street and Wall Street, because Wall Street has a very clear interest in keeping prices stable at all costs, and very little interest actually in expanding output. Main Street has an interest in stable prices, but it has an even greater interest in expanding output and employment. So once you abandon the mainstream model, you open up a set of political economic questions that the mainstream suppresses, and certainly central bank orthodoxy suppresses. The final thing I want to mention is, and this might be of greater interest in this group, is the section of this book that deals with so-called functional finance. Functional finance is a term introduced by Abba Lerner, who was a disciple of Keynes, and developed particularly the consequences for fiscal policy of the ideas of the general theory. Lerner is, the term functional finance he invented as a contrast with sound finance. Sound finance is the Wall Street mantra of balancing the budget at all costs and people be damned. Lerner's argument was, in the context of the general theory, that the government budget should be used to balance shortfalls or indeed excesses in private demand in order to keep aggregate demand on an even keel and keep the economy at full employment. The deficit in this context didn't matter as such. The deficit was a tool in order to maintain an appropriate level of aggregate demand. So that's sort of classical Lerner and classical functional finance. But there's a second issue that Lerner brings up and talks about a little bit, but it's kind of got lost. And the way into that issue maybe is to realize that functional finance as a device for stabilization, which is what I've just been talking about, does not imply long-term deficits. It does not imply a growing national debt, public debt, except in very extreme circumstances where private demand is kind of permanently depressed. People have thought that was the case. They feared that after World War II. As the Great Recession wore on, people revived those arguments, so-called secular stagnation, and very prominent economists, Larry Summers among them, took up that argument and said we are headed for a period of long depressed aggregate demand, and that may be true. I don't take a position one way or another on that, but what I want to suggest is that that's exceptional, and it isn't the problem of the deficit as we've actually experienced it, because we've experienced deficits and growing debt in a context where aggregate demand was not feeble. Private demand was not feeble. And we nevertheless didn't counterbalance the deficits that were necessary in slack years with the surpluses that counter-cyclical finance suggested for the boom years. We've had growing deficits, growing debt, despite the fact that that aggregate demand has been on the whole healthy over the last 50, 60 years. I think you explain that not by counter-cyclical finance, but by a second aspect of functional finance, and that is, how do you determine the appropriate composition of aggregate demand? How do you balance private consumption, private investment with public consumption and public investment? What is public consumption? Well, you could think summer camps for disadvantaged kids. You can think public parks. What is public investment? You can think roads, you can think schools. There's public expenditures generally cover a mix of investment and consumption. The composition of aggregate demand will determine by the same logic as Lerner's functional finance, whether the government should be running a deficit or whether the government should indeed be running a surplus. And you can interpret, this is maybe a generous interpretation, but you can interpret the deficits that have been run in most capitalist economies over the last 30, 40, 50 years as reflecting political choices and adapting the appropriate functional finance that goes with those political choices for public consumption and public investment. Let me give an example. I'm sure you've all read about, thought about the Green New Deal. And the question has come up, how do we pay for the Green New Deal? Well, the Green New Deal is primarily, it's not in the first instance a jobs program. The Green New Deal is an attempt to restructure the American economy, and by extension, similar programs in other countries, to restructure the economy in terms of the needs and purposes of the 21st century. If this is undertaken in a situation of full employment, something is going to have to give. Certainly if it's to be done in a rapid deployment burst. There are some obvious candidates for what should give, and the first thing that I think most people on the left would agree is consumption on the part of the 1% or the 0.1%, the beneficiaries of the so-called Trump tax reform, and that taxes would rise on those people, and if the costs of the Green New Deal were not borne by that sufficiently, then taxes would have to rise further down the line. If the Green New Deal were undertaken, and this becomes more likely as the COVID epidemic goes on, if the Green New Deal were undertaken in an environment of massive unemployment, then it's true that it becomes a jobs program, incidentally as it were, or at the same time, simultaneously, maybe not incidentally. And yes, in that case, according to the principles of functional finance and of the general theory, it can pay for itself. It can be paid for with deficit spending as a means of stabilizing the economy at the same time that these ambitious programs are carried out. But timing is all, and the environment is all. The program is not a program of to create jobs. It is a program to create good jobs and better jobs than exist for a lot of people in the private sector. But if you're undertaking that in a situation of full employment, then it's going to have to be paid for. It's not going to pay for itself. So let me close with just a minute on a question that you should be asking, and I ask myself, and that question is, do I really believe that Raising Keynes, my book, is going to change economics? Well, I certainly hope it'll play a part. I admit that. But I will say that no theoretical innovation will succeed on its own. Yes, it takes ideas, and I believe there are some good ideas in Raising Keynes, but ideas are necessary, they're not sufficient. Challenging a dominant ideology requires both ideas and as well a political movement that operates in symbiosis with these ideas. Actually, Keynes's general theory is a case in point. The Keynesian revolution was successful because it connected with the rise of political movements that were on the same wavelength. The New Deal in the United States, social democracy in Europe, the mutual support between the Keynesian economics of the 1930s to the 1970s and the political coalitions that supported New Deal politics, social democracy, were essential on both sides. And it's not a coincidence that as these coalitions fell apart in the 70s and into the 80s, we had the rise of Margaret Thatcher, Ronald Reagan. It's not coincidental that we had at the same time the eclipse of Keynesian economics and the rise of new classical economics, rational expectations, and all that. And by the same token, those were mutually supportive, and that symbiosis was provided on the right. I have to say, I don't know whether the political movement which can make use of the ideas that I have developed in Raising Keynes, I don't know whether that political movement exists or whether the political movements that we see are flashes in the pan. It's just not clear. I've seen a lot of political movements rise and with a lot of prospect and promise and fizzle out. So I can hope for better, but I'm not a clairvoyant. In the meantime, what I think people like me are doing, we're planting seeds. We don't know whether the soil is going to be hospitable. We don't know if we'll get enough rainfall. We don't even know if the crops that emerge, assuming we get the rainfall and good soil, we don't know if the crops that emerge are going to be sweet and tasty. We plant and we grow and we harvest certainly on faith and with hard work. And what I guess I would like to ask all of you is to join in the hard work and help reap the harvest and hope for the day that there is a politics to make use of these ideas. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Stephen. That was very inspiring. I guess, yeah, as you've said, in your age, you've seen stuff come and go. But I think we can take some comfort in the fact that how equilibrium theory was, founded by people like Jevons, and it was sort of gone for a moment, and then it sort of came back. So there is this dynamic in the history where ideas are picked up long after they were invented. So
Absolutely.
thank you for planting seeds. So we've got a fair few questions now in the chat. I'll start reading them out, but before that I'll be rude enough to actually also ask a question of my own, because I'm chairing this. I've got the luxury. So since you're in the business of inventing or making new theories that seek to supplant the dominant view within macroeconomics, where do you sort of see yourself in all of this? In economics, we have all these tribes, post-Keynesians, ecological economists, it's all very tribal. So do you see yourself as part of any of these tribes, or do you see yourself more as a free agent?
Well, since I've done different things, I guess I've belonged to different tribes at different points. I think there is a running theme in my career that goes back at least to the events of the late 60s. I mean, let me go back even further. I was trained as a mainstream economist. I made my name first as a mainstream economist. I got tenure on the basis of work as a mainstream economist. But I always had left, I was brought up in I would say a pink diaper, not a red diaper, but a pink diaper household. And so my inclinations were on the left, but I didn't see any contradiction between my politics and my economics, because I learned economics not as a description of the world. That came as a shock to me later, that people took economics seriously as a description of the world. I took economics as basically a theory of decision-making, operations research, how to maximize under constraints. And my introduction to economics was actually through a program at Harvard that brought together people from various disciplines to work on questions of designing multiple purpose water resource scheme, dams, irrigation, power, etc. And that was my economics. So I had no problem doing that economics in say 9 to 5, and then on my days off, I marching in protests against the Vietnam War, etc. And it was only when the confrontations really elevated that I began to see a connection between economics as a discipline and the social and economic order and political order in the United States and the world. And from that point on that I became a radical, heterodox, whatever economist. But since my interests varied, I suppose now you would say that the work I'm doing is really closest to what the post-Keynesians have done, what that tradition that comes out of the disciples of Keynes, like Joan Robinson, Nicholas Kaldor, etc. But I think the book you mentioned earlier, The Dismal Science, would have practically zero contact with post-Keynesian economics. So I guess I resist the single identity, even while I accept that I gladly accept those identities as part of who I am and what I do. But I think if you want a single label, I guess I call myself a heterodox economist, and if you want a political aspect to it, a radical heterodox economist.
Right. I'd even call you a pluralist then, which is, I guess, what we're trying to achieve in Rethinking Economics, do away with the single label. Anyway, since you're discussing macroeconomy, I guess it's only normal that the question of growth versus degrowth pops up. So there's a question here from John, and he's referring to a previous session today, but he just wants to know what your view of degrowth is in general. Is that, what is your general take on that? I know it's not mentioned in your book very much.
Well,
but,
it's interesting because I originally had a last chapter basically on that set of issues. And I decided at the end it was just too disjointed from the rest of the book. It really didn't connect with the book. So I'm trying still to find where to present that and get those ideas out. But basically, there are two strands to my thinking. One is to understand what is the role of growth in our economies, and putting aside the ecology, just trying to think about it separately from the ecological crisis that we're in. And here my argument, it connects to the dismal science actually more than to the work we've been talking about today. And that is that the problem with growth is that the best engine we found for growth is indeed capitalism. The problem with capitalism from this point of view is that it creates not only goods, but it creates people. And the kinds of people it creates are people who can succeed in markets, which requires a very heavy dose of individualism and self-interest. It requires a subscription to the idea that knowledge is basically what I call algorithmic and downplays experiential knowledge. It requires buying into a system in which community is minimized, if not erased. It requires, in short, becoming economic men and women, homo economicus, muliera economica. These are not the people I think any of us really want to be. And this is the problem with more and more and more. It's not actually the consumption itself, it's what you have to become in order to play in that consumption game. It's Adam Smith riffs on this at great length. So this is not a new problem, it's not a new recognition. Okay, so that's the problem with more and more and more.
Yeah, that's where it comes from.
The ecological crisis. Compound that with the ecological crisis. And by that I mean not only global warming, the climate crisis, but do we have the resources on this planet to sustain the kind of growth that we've experienced, even if we could solve the climate crisis? Could we sustain growth at the rate and the path that we've done? I think the answer is we don't know.
I recall.
Can I
sorry
just one thing? What do you do when you don't know? Well, I think you act prudently. And to act prudently is for the rich countries, your country, my country, is for us to embrace degrowth. Leave the space, whatever space there might be, to further draw down the resource base of the planet, to poor countries of Africa, Asia, Latin America. So I guess the answer is I'm a supporter of a qualified and targeted degrowth.
Well, so there. I recall a piece I read on a blog once with a physicist discussing with an economist, and the physicist was saying that if we maintain the growth of output and power in terms of power, I think we've only got around 200 years left before we literally cook the surface of the planet, like physically cooks it. Yeah, so there's definitely a limit to growth from the physicist's point of view. Anyway,
there's an answer to that. The answer is, well, you're just echoing Malthus, and you know, Malthus
yes,
running
sure.
out of food, and of course we're not running out of food. Look, we can feed a planet of 10 billion people much better than. So that's why I say we don't know. And the question is not that we know that we can't support the planet. The question is, what do you do when you don't know?
Yeah, that's for sure. I agree on that one. So here's a question from Sanjeet, where he asks if Keynes' vision. Oh, sorry, I'm reading the wrong question. It's actually from an anonymous attendee. He asks how Keynes would consider the interest in modern monetary theory. I mean, it's only natural this question pops up since you discussed deficits. Anyway, as well as other critiques from post-Keynesian theorists, like have the modern monetary theorists filled in what you called Keynes's theoretical incompleteness?
Well, I have to choose here between tact and candor. Which would you prefer?
Candor?
Candor? Okay. You know, it's debated how much Keynes understood of his own theory and its implications particularly for deficits and debts and so forth. And I can see why, because he wrote this book very quickly. Keynes has a reputation, a well-deserved reputation, for being among economists a very good writer. Now that may be damning with faint praise, but he does have that reputation. You couldn't prove that by the general theory. It's awfully written. It's confused. You can't blame him for it. He's charting out totally new territory. Very hard to do that, and it's very hard to do that and get everything right the first time. So there is this debate of how much Keynes understood, and there's even, I've read articles, was Keynes a Lernerian or was Lerner a Keynesian? Because Lerner is actually the one who fleshed out the implications of the general theory for fiscal policy. My own view is that Keynes understood a lot more than he's given credit for, but he had practical reservations as to how much you could get an uninformed public to go along with. Anyway, that's aside. Modern monetary theory has done an excellent job in bringing, reviving functional finance, basically. But as far as new content in modern monetary theory, I have to fall back on a review of a book by a really great economist of another generation, Charlie Kindleberger. At least Kindleberger is credited with this. Now, I don't know whether this is apocryphal or not, but Kindleberger is credited with saying about a book that he reviewed, there is much that is good and original in this book. Unfortunately, what is good is not original, and what is original is not good. So that, I have to say, is my take on modern monetary theory. I think it's been super important, and I don't think this is trivial at all. I think this is really a crucial step. in reviving modern learners' ideas and getting them into the political debate. But in terms of theoretical or new content, I think there isn't very much. And I think that what the new things that they stress are just not right. So that's a kind of mixed assessment.
Okay. Thank you for that. That's an interesting answer. I'm trying to get to grips with MMT myself. You know, it's kind of tough when you have to prop your head full of like conventional macro for classes and to get a good grade at the same time. Cohen Smeets has a question, because you say you want to sort of recreate like Keynes in sort of like a dynamic way. How does that relate to like complexity economics? You know, that you assume that markets are not self-regulating and they might not even go towards an equilibrium. Do you think so? Like complexity theory is the sort of preferred methodology that Keynes would have wanted? And do you want to go so far as to throw the notion of equilibrium completely out of economics, or what's?
No.
Where do you see it?
No, I don't know what Keynes would have embraced. I joke that I'm channeling Keynes, but you know, who knows what Keynes would have, if he'd had 80 years to think about it, read the literature and so forth. He was a smart guy. He would have come up with something really important, but I don't know what that would have been. This is not complexity theory, and it's not a rejection of equilibrium, in my view. It embraces equilibrium in the general sense of equilibrium as a balance of forces moving in different directions, pushing in different directions. So in that sense, mine is an equilibrium system. What I reject is the idea that can be characterized by supply equals demand. And that I'll just give you an example. So the normal sense of an equilibrium in a market is that demand equals supply. If you consider goods markets and labor markets together, you could have a case, and this comes up in my book, in which you're in equilibrium in the following sense. Producers are reducing prices in order to sell more goods, because they're in a situation of slack demand and they want to sell more goods, they reduce prices. There's unemployment, so wages are falling. How can that be an equilibrium? Well, it can be an equilibrium precisely in the sense that the real wage can remain constant because prices are falling at the same rate as wages are falling. And of course, on both sides, what they're trying to do, workers are trying to reduce real wages in order to make employment more attractive. Producers are trying to reduce real prices in order to sell more goods. But the actions of other agents are frustrating those desires. So you end up in an equilibrium in the sense that the pressures on wages are balancing the pressures on prices. And there is an equilibrium in that sense, but it's not a supply equals demand equilibrium. So that's what I mean by a dynamic equilibrium. And by the way, a characteristic of that equilibrium is that the real wage remains constant over time, stationary real wage. So I can, you know, that is an attempt to introduce the flavor, but I wouldn't, I invite people to read the book and get that.
Yeah, that's probably a good shot. I think we'll do 2 more questions and then we'll round off. We're reaching reaching an amount of time which is natural to end in Zoom webinars. One can only look at a screen for so long, I suppose. So Nivben Yehuda wants to ask you what you think a Keynesian solution to a stagnant economy look like in this time of a global pandemic and decreasing aggregate demand.
I'm sorry.
He wonders what a Keynesian solution to a stagnant economy look like in this time of global pandemic and decreasing aggregate demand. So basically, what do you think it would have done today, or learner, I suppose, since you said it was mostly learner?
Well, the fiscal policy part, but no, Keynes actually addressed. People talk about the analogy with the Great Recession, with the Great Depression. There's another analogy which I think is very relevant here and even more important perhaps, and that's World War II from the American point of view, because we did not have the destruction that Europe had and other parts of the world had. Mm-hmm. What we had, in a sense, it's not a perfect analogy, but what we had was we closed down a large part of the economy that was producing automobiles, durable goods, etc., in order to produce useless things. Useless in the sense munitions are going to be destroyed. They weren't useless in the sense that we were trying to
destroy someone.
Tyranny from expanding in the world, and I don't mean useless in that sense, but useless from an economic point of view. Well, if you think of this is similar in the sense that we've closed down part of the economy. We're not producing useless things, we're producing nothing. But what we did in World War II in the United States was we paid people a lot to produce those worthless things, even though there was nothing for them to buy, because the things they wanted to buy were not being produced. That's what we should be doing now, and that is what the initial unemployment program, I think, was accomplishing. We were putting a lot of money in people's pockets, and just like we did in World War II, and when the war was over, these fears of continuing depression didn't materialize because two things happened. People had the money, and then the goods that hadn't been produced came quickly online. I think we could have that kind of scenario in the United States and in Europe. If we continue to pay people, even though a lot of that money will be going into the bank, and we may have to wait until there's a vaccine. But if there is that purchasing power, then the economy can come back pretty quickly. It's not going to be the same economy. I think there are a lot of things that are going to be different, just as there were after World War II. I think air travel is one of those things that is going to be rethought. I think meetings like the one we're having is something that's going to be rethought. People were beginning to rethink meetings like this. I'll tell you a story about that. Even in the absence of COVID. We had a debate, long-standing debate and discussion in my faculty of trying to pressure the administration to divest from fossil fuels. We were gaining strength, and one of my colleagues, who was not terribly sympathetic to divestment on political grounds, but he proposed decarbonization of the endowment, of the finances of the university, which I thought was, from our point of view, a brilliant thing, even though he was not part of our group. There was some dissension among the ranks of my group, I have to say about that. But because if you think about it from a practical point of view, decarbonization really does include divestment. But the part of the argument for decarbonization is we shouldn't be having all these meetings that academics are having because of the toll they're taking on the planet from the point of view of traveling. And we should be doing just what we're doing now. We're doing it now under duress, but this was a proposal to do make a move in this direction without duress. And I think it's something which is going to get some traction as people begin to think about, you know, the changes in the economy that will that should take place to deal with other issues of the 21st century, the most pressing of which is the impending climate crisis. But the general point is that if the people who are unemployed now nevertheless have good financial balance sheets, they have money in the bank, so that when the economy can open, there is the aggregate demand. I think the economy will come out of it as well as the American economy came out of World War II, with minimal dislocation, none of the fears of Keynesians, not Keynes, but Keynesians, that we were going to be plunged back into depression materialized, and they didn't materialize because there was this purchasing power and a backlog of demand of things that had not been produced during the war. So that, I think that's an important analogy, and one that could guide us in sensible policies. Will we continue sensible policies? No, because the halls of Congress are now debating precisely whether they will continue this these generous unemployment benefits in the United States, or as they say, scale them down so people have to go back to work, even though there may not be any work to go back to.
Wow. Well, yeah, it's pretty interesting to see what's going on in the US from across the Atlantic. To have that outside view, it's I can't believe that they chose to send out checks. That is an incredible decision to me. But anyway,
the $600.
Yeah.
Well,
yeah, by mail, you know, like it's so slow. But that's a tangent. That's a tangent.
No. By the way, those checks mostly get credited to people. If people have bank accounts, of course, a lot of people are unbanked, but if people have bank accounts, they go directly into their. I mean, there's some setup problems. We really, you know, nobody was prepared for this, obviously, and.
Yeah, I can say that about my country too. Either way, we'll go for the last question, and then we'll sort of round up. So Sanjeet's question's been top rated for a pretty long time now. So he wonders if Keynes, it's sort of back to what Keynes, since you're writing about Keynes, I suppose you've sort of become, people ask about what Keynes would have done. So here we go. Can Keynes' vision be reconciled with the post-capitalist vision? So that in the sense of a radical change in property relations, especially anti-imperialist visions. So how much does Keynes' vision depend on centrality of the nation state, and how can that engage with the international and globalized nature of financial capital today? It's not an easy question.
Yeah, well, you know, as I said, I have no direct line to Keynes as to what he would have thought. A colleague of mine, Jim Crotty, wrote a book published last year, arguing that Keynes really was a socialist. I think that's a step too far, but Keynes did describe himself in a I think it was in a BBC interview, as a liberal socialist. Not quite clear what it meant. But Keynes was also very pragmatic and ready to change with the times. The capitalism he defended was certainly not 19th century, every man for himself, individualistic capital. That was not, he was defending, if he defended capitalism, it was as a civilization. And he was, in this respect, a man of his times. He was a partial to eugenics. He had the genteel anti-Semitism of his class and time. I say genteel to distinguish it from, the more vicious kinds of anti-Semitism that showed themselves in those times. So, he was not he was a man of his times at the same time as very forward thinking. And I think he would embrace the changes that have taken place. I think he would be open to new ideas and new problems. I mean, he never once that anybody is aware of ever considered the problem of planetary ecology. It was not, on the agenda. So very hard to know how he would react to climate chaos and the need for international cooperation to solve that problem. But he was certainly aware of the problems of capitalism in the interwar period and the need for international cooperation to address those problems. So it's unimaginable that he would not be a strong advocate of a global solution to the current global crisis.
Yeah, definitely. Definitely. Thank you very much for your answers, Stephen. We covered a lot of ground there. I wish we also could have got a little more into depth about, these implicit assumptions that you write about in both of your books, but I'll try and email them to you afterwards.
I invite people to email me, and I will try to deal with as many of your questions as I can. You can find me easily on the web, but the email address is smarglin, first initial and last name, @harvard.edu. So I hope to be in touch with you. Thank you very much for this opportunity.
Oh, thank you, Stephen. And I want to say that well, we've got some interesting more sessions coming up in slot 3 of today's program. So make sure to follow that. So we'll have 2 sessions on how to do pluralist economics. So how does that look like? What does it look like in a classroom? There will be one session that I will be hosting with Joe Mitchell. And then there is the economy studies from Rethinking Economics Netherlands. I urge you to check out both. They're very interesting. And I have to say, thank you so much, Stephen, for joining us today. And thank you to all who have been watching. It's a pleasure to see that so many people are interested in this. So yes, have a good afternoon or morning or evening, no matter where you are in the world. And we will catch you all soon. Oh, and someone's asking how many people were here. Well, I think we reached into 120 at some point. Yeah, it's a little, it keeps going up and down, but yeah, I think that was our max. So thank you.
Thank you all.